After inheriting his grandfather's aging farm in western Kentucky, 61-year-old Samuel Carter decided to fill an abandoned hand-dug well that had been unused for decades. Neighbors laughed, saying he was destroying a piece of history and spending money on a useless project. But while clearing brush around the site, Samuel uncovered an old government survey marker that had not been visible for generations. What began as a simple cleanup project soon revealed forgotten property records, a misplaced boundary fence, and important details that changed how everyone viewed the land and the old well they thought they understood. At 61 years old, Samuel Carter never expected that one of the biggest decisions he would make on the family farm would involve something everyone else had forgotten. The Carter farm rested among the rolling hills of western Kentucky, where generations of his family had raised tobacco, corn, and beef cattle. The farmhouse had changed very little over the years. The front porch still creaked beneath heavy boots, the old red barn still leaned slightly toward the pasture, and the maple tree planted by Samuel's grandfather continued to shade the yard every summer. After Samuel's older brother passed away, ownership of the farm finally fell to him. For several years, much of the land had simply been leased to a neighboring cattle producer. The fields remained productive, but many corners of the property had received little attention. Samuel decided it was time to walk every acre again, not because he planned to expand, but because he wanted to know the land as well as his grandfather once had. One cool morning in early March, he pushed through a patch of overgrown cedar and wild blackberry bushes near the edge of an old pasture. There, almost hidden beneath vines and fallen branches, sat an abandoned hand-dug stone well. Samuel remembered it immediately. His grandfather had stopped using it decades earlier after a modern drilled well was installed closer to the house. Since then, someone had covered the opening with weathered wooden planks and a sheet of rusted metal. Time had done the rest. The boards had begun to rot, and the ground around the opening had settled unevenly. One careless step could send a person or a calf straight through. Samuel removed a few branches and quietly examined the old structure. The stonework was impressive. Even after nearly a century, much of it remained intact, but admiration did not erase the danger. Later that afternoon, he mentioned the well while drinking coffee at the local feed store. "I'm thinking about having it properly filled," he said. The room fell quiet for a moment. One man shook his head. "You can't fill that in. It's part of the farm's history." Another chuckled. "Next, you'll tear down the old barn because it's inconvenient." Several others laughed. Samuel smiled politely but did not argue. He understood why people felt attached to old places. He felt the same way himself. But he also knew that preserving history did not always mean preserving every structure exactly as it stood. A dangerous well hidden beneath weeds was not teaching anyone about the past. It was simply waiting for someone to get hurt. That evening, Samuel walked back to the pasture as the sun settled behind the Kentucky hills. He stood beside the weathered stones for several minutes. His grandfather had drawn water there. His father probably had too. The well had served the farm faithfully for generations, but its purpose had ended long ago. Samuel quietly made up his mind. He would honor the family's history, but he would also take responsibility for the farm's future. Sometimes caring for old land meant knowing when it was time to safely let something go. As he cleared another armful of brush from around the well, something solid caught the blade of his shovel just beneath the soil. It was not another stone from the well. It looked like something far older, and someone had placed it there with remarkable precision. The following Monday morning, Samuel drove to the county planning office before making any decisions about the old well. He had spent enough years farming to know that good intentions were not always enough. Some jobs had to be done properly. The woman at the front desk directed him to the county's Environmental Services Department, where an inspector explained the recommended process for permanently abandoning an old hand-dug well. "You don't just push dirt into it," the inspector said. "If it's going to be closed, it needs to be done safely so the ground remains stable and groundwater stays protected." Samuel appreciated the straightforward explanation. He collected several information sheets, made notes about approved filling materials, and contacted a local excavation contractor who had experience closing abandoned farm wells. "It isn't a complicated job," the contractor told him over the phone, "but it's one worth doing correctly." A few days later, before the equipment arrived, Samuel decided to clear the thick brush surrounding the well. Years of cedar saplings, wild vines, and fallen limbs had almost hidden the entire area from view. Working slowly with a pair of loppers and a shovel, he uncovered pieces of the original stone border that had disappeared beneath layers of leaves. The more he cleared, the more the old site revealed itself. Then his shovel struck something unexpectedly solid. It was not limestone like the well. The sound was sharper, almost deliberate. Curious, Samuel knelt and brushed away the soil with his gloves. A square stone emerged from the ground. Unlike the rough stones surrounding the well, this one had smooth, carefully cut edges. Only a few inches remained above the surface. Most of it had been buried beneath decades of accumulated soil. He gently washed away more dirt with a bottle of water he carried in the truck. Faint markings slowly appeared, letters, numbers, and what looked like a small engraved cross near the center. Samuel frowned. This doesn't belong to the well. He had walked past that spot countless times over the years and had never noticed it. Whatever it was, someone had intentionally placed it there long ago. Instead of digging it out, he took several photographs from different angles. He measured its location relative to the old fence line and the well before covering it lightly with a bucket to protect it until he learned more. That evening, he emailed the photographs to the county surveyor's office with a short message. I found this while clearing around an abandoned well on my family's farm. Can anyone tell me what it is? He expected a reply sometime the following week. Instead, his phone rang early the next morning. The county surveyor sounded unusually interested. Mr. Carter, he said, I'd appreciate it if you didn't move that stone. Samuel glanced toward the pasture through his kitchen window. I wasn't planning to. The surveyor paused for a moment. Good, because from what I can see in your photographs, I think you've uncovered one of the oldest original survey markers, still standing in this part of the county. 2 days later, Samuel met the county surveyor at the edge of the pasture. The surveyor, Michael Harris, arrived carrying a weathered field notebook, a GPS receiver, and copies of several old property maps stored in the county archives. Before saying much, he walked directly to the stone marker. He knelt beside it, brushed away a little more soil, and carefully examined the carved symbols. After a long moment, he smiled. I was hoping this was what I thought it was. Samuel looked at him with curiosity. So, what exactly is it? Michael stood and unfolded one of the faded maps. This appears to be an original government survey marker placed sometime in the late 19th century. He pointed toward the carved cross. Markers like this were often used as permanent reference points when farms in this area were first officially surveyed. Samuel studied the stone again. I've lived here most of my life. I never knew it was here. Michael nodded. That's not unusual. Many of these markers slowly disappear beneath vegetation, erosion, or decades of accumulated soil. They're still there. People simply stop noticing them. The surveyor compared the old map with a digital version displayed on his tablet. The marker's location matched almost perfectly. I'd say this stone hasn't moved in well over 100 years. Samuel could not help but smile. His grandfather had probably walked past it hundreds of times. So had his father. Perhaps they had known exactly what it was. Or perhaps, like everyone else, they had eventually forgotten. Michael continued studying the maps. What interests me even more is how this marker relates to your property lines. He traced a pencil across the faded survey drawing. This marker wasn't placed because of the well. It was placed long before anyone built that well. Samuel looked toward the old stone well a few yards away. So, they aren't connected? Not directly. The well was simply dug near an existing survey reference. That answer surprised Samuel. For years, he had assumed everything in that corner of the pasture had been built at roughly the same time. Instead, the land was telling a much older story. Back at the farmhouse, Samuel searched through several boxes of family papers stored in the attic. Most contained faded photographs, livestock records, and handwritten seed purchases dating back decades. Near the bottom of one box, he found an old notebook that had belonged to his grandfather. Inside were simple sketches of pasture fences, crop rotations, and grazing plans. One sentence, written in careful pencil, caught his attention. Never move the old survey stone. Build around it. Samuel read the line twice. His grandfather had known, not because the stone held hidden treasure or carried sentimental value, but because he understood that accurate landmarks mattered. The next morning, Samuel called Michael. I found something in my grandfather's notes. The surveyor listened quietly before replying, "I think it's time we measure that entire corner of your farm." Neither man expected a dramatic discovery, but both agreed that after more than a century, it was worth making sure the old boundaries still matched the land everyone believed they knew. The following week, Michael Harris returned with another surveyor and a truck carrying modern surveying equipment. Samuel watched as they unloaded tripods, GPS receivers, and measuring instruments that looked worlds apart from the steel tapes his grandfather had once used. "It's amazing how much technology has changed," Samuel said. Michael smiled. "The tools are different, but the goal hasn't changed. We're still trying to answer the same question: where does the land actually begin and end?" The two surveyors first confirmed the location of the old stone marker. After comparing its position with county records and several additional reference points nearby, Michael looked satisfied. "The marker is exactly where it should be. It has survived remarkably well." For the rest of the morning, they worked their way across the pasture. Samuel followed at a respectful distance, occasionally answering questions about old fence repairs or changes made over the years. Around midday, Michael stopped beside an aging woven wire fence that separated Samuel's pasture from his neighbor's hayfield. He studied his equipment for several moments before looking towards Samuel. "This is interesting." Samuel walked over. "Something wrong?" Michael shook his head. "Nothing serious." He pointed toward the fence. "This fence doesn't quite follow the original surveyed boundary." Samuel looked across the pasture. It seemed perfectly straight to him. "How far off are we talking?" Michael checked his notes. "Only a few feet in places, probably the result of repairs over many decades." He explained that old wooden fence posts often rotted or were knocked over by livestock. When replacements were installed, people naturally lined them up with the existing fence instead of measuring from the original property markers. After enough repairs over several generations, small shifts could gradually appear. No one intended to move a boundary. It simply happened little by little. Samuel nodded. "That makes sense. My father replaced sections after storms, and I've done the same. Neither of us ever thought to call a surveyor." Rather than making assumptions, Samuel drove to visit his neighbor, David Miller, that afternoon. David had farmed the adjoining property for more than 30 years. When Samuel explained what the surveyors had found, David did not become defensive. Instead, he laughed softly. "If anyone moved that fence, it certainly wasn't you or me." The two men returned to the pasture together and listened as Michael explained the measurements. "There isn't a dispute here," Michael said. "Only an opportunity to document the original boundary before future owners inherit confusion." David appreciated the explanation. "I'd rather settle something this simple with a conversation than leave questions for our children someday." Samuel smiled. "I couldn't agree more." The three men spent the rest of the afternoon comparing old aerial photographs, county records, and the new survey measurements. By sunset, they had reached an agreement. The fence would eventually be moved back to match the surveyed boundary during its next scheduled replacement. There was no urgency, no argument, and no need for lawyers. There were simply good neighbors making practical decisions. As Michael packed away his equipment, he looked once more at the old survey marker standing quietly beneath the evening sky. "It spent more than 100 years waiting for someone to notice it again," he said. Samuel smiled as he looked across the peaceful pasture. Sometimes the most valuable discoveries did not uncover something new. They simply reminded people to take a closer look at what had been there all along. Over the next several weeks, Samuel and David kept their promise. Neither man rushed to move the fence. There was no reason to. The pasture had worked well for years, and the few feet separating the old fence from the surveyed boundary had never caused conflict. Instead, they agreed to wait until autumn, when the cattle would be moved to a different field and replacing the aging fence would be much easier. "It makes more sense to do it once than to fix it twice," David said. Samuel agreed. Good farming usually rewards patience. Before any work began, Michael Harris filed an updated survey with the county recorder's office. The document did not transfer ownership or change anyone's deed. It simply confirmed where the original boundary had always been. Future owners would have clear records instead of relying on old assumptions. Samuel appreciated that. His grandfather had believed in leaving the farm a little better than he found it. Accurate records seemed just as important as healthy soil. A month later, the excavation contractor arrived to permanently close the abandoned well. Samuel watched carefully as the crew removed the remaining weathered timbers covering the opening. For the first time in decades, the old stone shaft was completely visible. It stretched farther underground than Samuel had imagined. One of the workers shined a flashlight into the darkness. "You can tell this was built well," he said. "Whoever dug it knew what they were doing." Samuel nodded. It served this farm for a long time. Following county recommendations, the crew filled the well using approved materials designed to stabilize the ground while protecting groundwater. The work took most of the day. When they finished, the opening had disappeared beneath compacted soil. The area was graded to match the surrounding pasture, leaving no dangerous depression behind. Standing beside the freshly leveled ground, Samuel felt an unexpected sense of peace. He was not erasing history. He was removing a hazard that no longer served the farm. Before leaving, he gathered several of the original limestone blocks that had formed the upper edge of the well. Rather than discarding them, he stacked them neatly beside the old equipment shed. One day he thought they could become part of a small garden or a simple memorial to the farm's early years. Nothing needed to be wasted. That fall, Samuel and David replaced the aging fence together. Working side by side over 2 weekends, they set new corner posts according to the surveyed boundary before stretching fresh woven wire across the pasture. Neither man kept score over the few feet that had changed. Both understood that preserving a good relationship mattered far more than arguing over a narrow strip of grass. When the work was finished, David leaned against the new fence and smiled. "You know, people thought you were making a mistake by filling that old well." Samuel looked across the pasture toward the place where it had once stood. "I've been thinking about that. If I hadn't decided to make the farm safer, none of us would have found the survey marker." David nodded. "And we probably would have left that old fence exactly where it was for another generation." Samuel smiled quietly. Sometimes the smallest decisions did not solve the problem people expected. They uncovered a better one to solve instead. As autumn settled across the Kentucky hills, word of the story slowly spread beyond the neighboring farms. Before long, someone from the county extension office called to ask whether Samuel would share what he had learned. A few weeks after the well had been safely closed, Samuel thought the project was finally behind him. Then one afternoon his phone rang. The caller introduced herself as Karen Mitchell from the county extension office. "We've heard about what happened on your farm," she said. Samuel smiled. "I hope nobody thinks I uncovered buried gold." Karen laughed. "Actually, what impressed us wasn't what you found. It was the way you handled it." She explained that several local families had recently inherited farmland from parents and grandparents. Many of those properties contained old wells, aging fences, forgotten drainage ditches, and missing property markers. "What happened on your farm is something other people can learn from," she said. A few weeks later, Samuel agreed to host a small workshop on his property. There were no television cameras or speeches, just a dozen farmers walking slowly across the pasture. Samuel stopped beside the old survey marker. "When I first came here, I wasn't looking for this stone," he said. "I was trying to make this pasture safer." He pointed toward the grassy area where the abandoned well had once been. "You can't even tell a well was here anymore." "That's exactly how it should be." One young farmer raised his hand. "My father always said we had an old well somewhere behind our barn. I've never looked for it." Another man admitted he had never updated the survey on land he inherited almost 15 years earlier. Michael Harris, who had joined the visit, nodded. "Most farms don't have major problems, but small questions become expensive ones when nobody checks them." As the group continued walking, the conversations became more practical than historical. Farmers compared notes about fencing, drainage, and keeping accurate records. Several exchanged telephone numbers, promising to help one another with future projects. Watching them, Samuel realized something unexpected. The survey marker had not changed the county. It had simply started a conversation many people should have had years earlier. As the last truck pulled away that afternoon, Karen thanked Samuel. "You probably prevented more problems than you'll ever know." Samuel looked back across the quiet pasture and smiled. "I only fixed one corner of my own farm." Karen smiled in return. Sometimes that's how the best examples begin. As winter slowly gave way to spring, the corner of Samuel's pasture looked very different. The abandoned well was gone. Fresh grass had begun covering the carefully graded soil, making it almost impossible for a visitor to tell that a hand-dug well had once stood there. Only Samuel knew exactly where it had been. A few yards away, however, the old survey marker remained. Unlike before, it was no longer hidden beneath blackberry vines and fallen branches. Samuel had cleared the surrounding brush, leaving a small circle of native grass around the stone. He wanted people to notice it, not because it was extraordinary, but because it had quietly marked the land for well over a century. One Saturday morning, Samuel loaded several limestone blocks from the old well into the back of his tractor. Instead of leaving them behind the equipment shed, he carried them to the survey marker. Using the stones, he built a simple low border around the marker. It was not a monument or anything decorative enough to attract tourists. It simply protected the area from mowing equipment while making the marker easier to see. His granddaughter Emma stopped by that afternoon while visiting with her parents. She watched her grandfather place the last stone into position. "Is this where the old well used to be?" she asked. Samuel smiled. "Close. The well was over there." He pointed several yards away before resting his hand on the survey marker. "This stone has actually been here longer." Emma looked puzzled. "So why didn't you keep the well too?" Samuel sat on one of the limestone blocks before answering. "Because history and safety don't always ask us to make the same decision." She waited quietly. The well had become dangerous. It had already finished the job it was built to do. But this marker still has a purpose. It helps people understand where the land begins. Emma nodded slowly. "I think I understand. We didn't erase history. We just kept the part that's still useful." Samuel smiled. "Exactly." A few weeks later, he mounted a small weather-resistant plaque on a wooden post beside the stone. It contained only a few short sentences. "Original survey marker. Estimated late 1800s. Preserved as part of the Carter family farm's history." There were no dramatic stories or exaggerated claims, only simple facts. Visitors who noticed the marker often stopped to read the plaque before asking Samuel about the old well. He always told the same story. "The well served this farm for generations. When it became unsafe, we closed it properly." The marker reminds us where the story began. Over time, neighbors who had once questioned Samuel's decision began seeing the area differently. They no longer focused only on the missing well. Instead, they appreciated that the farm still honored its history while making the property safer for future generations. One afternoon, as Samuel finished mowing the pasture, a familiar pickup pulled into the driveway. It belonged to Frank Brooks, the neighbor who had joked about Samuel destroying an important piece of history. Frank climbed out, smiled awkwardly, and removed his hat. "I think I owe you an apology," he said. Samuel leaned against the tractor and smiled. "I had a feeling you'd stop by sooner or later." Several days after apologizing, Frank returned carrying a folded map. "I've got something to show you," he said. They spread the map across the tailgate of the truck. "I finally dug out my father's old farm records," Frank explains. "I hadn't opened that drawer in 20 years. Among the papers were hand-drawn field notes, an old survey sketch, and a faded page reminding future owners about an abandoned well behind the machine shed. I would have forgotten it completely if it weren't for your story," Frank admitted. That afternoon, the two men walked across Frank's property. Sure enough, hidden beneath tall weeds and young cedar trees, they found the weathered cover of the old well. It looked almost exactly as Samuel's had months earlier. Frank released a slow breath. "I've driven past this spot hundreds of times. I stopped seeing it years ago." Samuel nodded. "It's amazing what becomes invisible when you see it every day." The following week, Frank contacted the county office to ask about the proper way to close the well. He also scheduled a survey to confirm several aging fence corners that had never been checked since his father owned the farm. "I'm not expecting to find anything unusual," Frank said with a smile. "I just don't want my children inheriting unanswered questions." Samuel liked that answer. It reminded him of the decision he had made on his own farm. Not because something was already causing a dispute, but because leaving clear records was part of caring for the land. As they stood beside the old well one last time, Frank looked at Samuel and smiled. "You know, I laughed when you started all this." Samuel laughed too. "I remember. I'm glad you ignored me." Samuel looked across the neighboring fields stretching toward the horizon. Sometimes the greatest value of doing the right thing was not solving your own problem, It was giving someone else a reason to solve theirs. As summer settled over western Kentucky, life on the Carter farm returned to its familiar routine. The cattle grazed quietly. Hayfields were cut on schedule. The repaired fence blended naturally into the landscape, as if it had always been there. One Saturday morning, Samuel noticed something unusual. A young couple had stopped their truck near the entrance to his pasture. They were not tourists. They had recently purchased a small farm a few miles away and had heard about Samuel through the county extension office. "We're not here just to see the marker," the husband said with a smile. "We're here because we're trying to learn how to take care of an old farm." Samuel invited them to walk the pasture. Instead of talking only about survey markers, he pointed out ordinary things: a drainage ditch that needed to stay clear, a line of trees protecting the creek bank, and a section of fence that had been repaired before it failed. Then he stopped beside the old survey marker. "This stone gets all the attention," he said, "but it isn't the most important thing on this farm." The couple looked surprised. "What is?" Samuel smiled. "Paying attention. If you know your land well enough, small problems stay small." The couple nodded thoughtfully. Before leaving, they thanked Samuel for his time. "We expected to learn about one old stone," the wife said. "Instead, we learned how to look at our own farm differently." After they drove away, Samuel stood quietly beside the pasture gate. The survey marker had not made his farm famous. It had not increased the value of the land overnight. What it had done was much simpler. It reminded people that good farms were not built by dramatic discoveries. They were built by thousands of careful decisions repeated year after year. Looking across the fields, Samuel smiled. That lesson was worth passing on long after the story of the old well had been forgotten. Several weeks later, Samuel's son stopped by after work. As they walked across the farm, he glanced toward the marker. "I've noticed something," he said. "People don't ask about the well anymore." Samuel smiled. "They ask about the marker." His son laughed. "And every time you tell the same story." "Because it's still the same lesson," Samuel replied. "When you take care of the land properly, the land usually takes care of the people who come after you." They stopped beside the marker for a moment. Samuel looked across the fields his family had worked for generations. "I used to think inheriting a farm meant receiving land," he said quietly. "Now I think it means receiving responsibility." His son nodded. "And one day it'll be my turn." Samuel placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then don't worry about making everything perfect. Just leave it a little better than you found it." As the sun dipped behind the Kentucky hills, Samuel felt content. The old well was gone. The survey marker remained. The records were accurate, and the neighbors were on good terms. None of it had made him richer, but it had made the farm stronger. To Samuel, that was an inheritance worth passing on. Near the end of summer, Samuel received a certified envelope from the county recorder's office. Inside was the finalized survey, along with confirmation that the updated boundary map had been added to the property's official records. He placed the documents on the kitchen table and smiled. His grandfather had always kept careful records. Now the next generation would have one less mystery to solve. That afternoon, Michael Harris stopped by one last time. "I thought you'd want these," he said, handing Samuel laminated copies of the survey map. "They'll last much longer in the barn than regular paper." Samuel thanked him. Together they walked to the old survey marker. The stone looked almost unchanged from the day it had been uncovered, except now it was clean, protected, and easy to find. "I think it'll still be here another 100 years," Michael said. "I hope so," Samuel replied. Before leaving, Michael looked around the pasture. "You know, this project could have turned into a legal dispute." Samuel nodded. "It easily could have, but everyone chose to work together instead." Michael smiled. "I wish every boundary question ended this way." A few days later, Samuel gathered his children and grandchildren for a family picnic beneath the old maple tree. After lunch, he led them to the survey marker. He showed them the map, explained why the fence had been moved, and pointed toward the grassy spot where the abandoned well had once stood. Emma looked at the stone and grinned. "So now we know exactly where this corner of the farm begins." "We do," Samuel said. "And now you'll know too." He handed the laminated survey to his son. "Keep this with the farm records. If this land stays in our family, no one should have to guess again." As everyone walked back toward the house, Samuel glanced over his shoulder one last time. The pasture looked ordinary, but sometimes ordinary places held the most important lessons. The old survey marker had done its job for generations. Now, thanks to a simple decision to make the farm safer, it would continue guiding those who cared for the land long after Samuel was gone. On a quiet September evening, Samuel walked alone to the corner of the pasture once more. The grass had fully covered the place where the abandoned well had stood. Nearby, the old survey marker rested exactly where it had for more than a century. Nothing about the scene seemed remarkable, and that was exactly how Samuel liked it. He thought back to the day his shovel struck the buried stone. At the time, he believed he was simply clearing brush before filling a dangerous well. He never imagined that one decision would lead to old maps, honest conversations with neighbors, and a deeper appreciation for the farm his family had cared for over generations. Before heading back to the house, Samuel opened the small notebook that had belonged to his grandfather. On the last blank page, he wrote a short message for whoever might one day inherit the land. The value of this farm isn't measured only in acres. Take care of the soil. Keep good records. Respect your neighbors. Never assume the old ways are always right or that the new ways are always better. Learn why something exists before you decide whether it should stay. He closed the notebook and smiled. When he returned to the farmhouse, he placed it beside the updated survey map in the family record cabinet. The notebook carried the family's memories. The survey carried the facts. Together, they told the story of the farm. Years later, whenever his grandchildren asked about the stone marker in the pasture, Samuel never spoke about discovering something financially valuable beneath the ground. Instead, he told them about responsibility. He explained that preserving history did not always mean keeping every old structure. Sometimes it meant recording the past accurately, removing dangers when necessary, and leaving clear information for those who came next. The old well had served its purpose. The survey marker still served its own. The farm was better because someone had cared enough to understand the difference. As the evening sun settled over the Kentucky hills, Samuel looked across the fields with quiet gratitude. In the end, the greatest inheritance he received was not a forgotten landmark or a corrected boundary. It was the chance to leave the land safer, clearer, and better prepared for the next generation. If Samuel's story reminded you that caring for old land requires both respect and responsibility, share your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done after discovering the forgotten survey marker beside that abandoned well? If you enjoyed this story, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss more stories about hardworking farmers, forgotten history, and unexpected discoveries. Thank you for watching, and remember, sometimes the most valuable thing hidden on an old farm is not treasure, but the knowledge that helps the next generation care for it wisely.